3 days before Thanksgiving, my son called and said 9 words I never expected to hear from the boy I raised. "Dad, don't make the drive. Liam thinks it's better this way." I was standing in my kitchen in Victoria, British Columbia, still wearing my coat from the grocery store, a bag of sweet potatoes on the counter because I had already started planning what I was going to bring. I set the bag down slowly. I looked out the window at the gray November water in the strait, and I thought, 64 years old, and my own son is delivering messages from his wife about whether I'm allowed at his dinner table. I asked him what that meant, better this way. He said Liam had some concerns about the dynamic, that his parents were coming from Calgary and the house wasn't big enough. That last Easter had left things tense. What happened at Easter was that Liam had made a comment about my pension, about how government workers had it easy, and I had said, quietly, that 31 years maintaining water infrastructure in this province wasn't exactly easy. I hadn't raised my voice, I had said my piece, and I had moved on. But Liam had gone cold for the rest of the weekend, and my son had spent 2 days apologizing to him for something I still don't fully understand. "Dad," my son said, "it's just one Thanksgiving." I told him I hadn't missed a Thanksgiving with him in 40 years, not when his mother and I divorced, not when I had a kidney stone so bad I drove myself to the hospital the morning of and still made it to her place by 4 o'clock. He was quiet on the line. I could hear something in the background, movement, a door closing. "Maybe Christmas will be different," he said. I hung up and stood there in my kitchen for a long time. Then I called the restaurant at the Fairmont Empress and made a reservation for one. I want to tell you where I was 7 years ago and where I am now, because those are two very different places, and the distance between them wasn't something I traveled alone. The dining room at the Empress was full that Thursday. I had dressed properly because that felt important. Gray slacks and the blue sweater my son had given me 2 birthdays ago. The hostess was kind enough not to make it obvious when she seated me. Small table near the window. View of the inner harbor. The lights were starting to come on across the water and the ferries were moving in the dusk, and it was genuinely beautiful and I could not feel any of it. I ordered the roasted squash soup and a glass of Pinot Noir from the Okanagan because that seemed like the right thing to do when you were spending Thanksgiving in a hotel restaurant at 64. The wine was good. The soup was good. I have no memory of tasting either. I was thinking about my grandson Owen. He was 4. I had seen him 6 weeks earlier when my son brought him to Victoria for a weekend while Liam was at a conference, and we had spent Saturday afternoon at Beacon Hill Park feeding the ducks and arguing about whether the big white one was a swan or a very confident goose. Owen had been certain it was a dragon in disguise. I had told him he was probably right. I had been looking forward to seeing him at Thanksgiving. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. I was halfway through my soup when I noticed the couple at the table across from me. They were probably in their late 60s, both of them, and they were watching me with the careful, unobtrusive concern of people who have been around long enough to recognize loneliness when they see it sitting by a window in a nice sweater. The woman leaned over to the man and said something. He nodded. Then he stood up and walked over to my table, which is not something Canadians typically do, and I want to be clear about that because it tells you something about who he was. He said, "Excuse me, I hope this isn't too forward, but we have 2 empty chairs and a turkey that is almost certainly more bird than 2 people can handle. My wife would take it as a personal kindness if you'd join us." I looked at him. His name, I would learn, was Frank Kowalski. He was 68 years old, retired after 35 years as a high school shop teacher in Nanaimo. He had hands like a carpenter, wide and deliberate, and he was wearing a burgundy tie that was slightly crooked, and he hadn't fixed it all evening, which I later understood was because his wife Eleanor had straightened it for him before they left the house, and he was leaving it exactly as she had said it. I said I didn't want to impose on their evening. He said the only thing imposing on their evening was the silence, and they'd had enough of that since their youngest moved to Halifax. Eleanor stood up from their table then, a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She waved me over like I was already family and just hadn't realized it yet. I picked up my wine glass. I moved to their table. I had no idea what I was walking into. We stayed at that table for 3 hours. Frank and Eleanor Kowalski had been married for 41 years. They had 3 children, 2 daughters in Ontario and a son in Halifax. Their grandchildren were scattered and growing fast in the way grandchildren do, and they had learned to celebrate holidays in whatever configuration was available rather than grieving the configuration they wanted. "This is harder than it sounds," Eleanor said. "We still get it wrong sometimes, but you learn." I told them about my son, about Liam, about the phone call 3 days ago and the sweet potato still sitting on my kitchen counter. Frank didn't offer advice. He just listened, and then he said, "That's a hard thing." 2 words. That's all. But he said them like he meant them, and somehow that was more than enough. When we finally asked for the bill, Eleanor refused to let me pay for my portion. She said it was Thanksgiving and that was final. Then she wrote their phone number on the back of a receipt and slid it across the table. "Frank makes a fish chowder on Sunday afternoons," she said. "Nothing special, just something we do. You're welcome, any time." I drove home along Dallas Road with the windows down despite the cold, and I thought about that phrase. You're welcome, any time, not maybe sometime, not we should do this again. Any time. I put Eleanor's number in my phone. I told myself I probably wouldn't call. I called the following Sunday. Frank's chowder was, in fact, something special. Smoked salmon from a place he knew in Parksville, potatoes from his garden, cream and leeks, and a seasoning he refused to fully disclose. They lived in a small house in James Bay, close enough to the water that you could smell the ocean from the front porch. The kitchen was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of people who actually used it, and there were photographs everywhere. Grandchildren in hockey gear, daughters at graduations. A black and white photo of Frank's parents in Poland before they immigrated that he had framed and hung above the kitchen window. Their youngest son, Patrick, was visiting from Halifax that Sunday with his girlfriend, a nurse named Sandra, who immediately recruited me into her argument with Frank about whether the chowder needed more dill. I took her side. Frank acted betrayed. Eleanor declared us both right and added the dill herself. By the time I drove home that evening, I realized I had laughed more in 4 hours than I had in the previous 2 months. The Sundays became a habit. Then they became something more than a habit. Frank and I started going to a hardware store in Langford on Saturday mornings because he was restoring an old workbench, and I had some knowledge of joinery from years of puttering around my garage. Eleanor started sending me home with containers of soup and leftovers with the same energy she directed at her actual children. When their daughter Christine came from Toronto in February, she accepted me at the table without question, which I would later understand was because Eleanor had told her, "There's a man named Thomas who comes on Sundays. He's part of the picture now." And Christine had simply said, "Okay, Mom." My son called me on my birthday in March. He said, "Happy birthday." He asked if I was keeping busy. I said yes. He asked about my knee, which had been bothering me the previous winter. I asked about Owen. He said Owen was great, really talking now, full sentences about superheroes and construction equipment. I asked if I might come for a visit sometime. He said he'd have to check with Liam about the calendar. I said of course. I sat with that for a few days. I had been sitting with variations of it for almost a year by then. The calendar check. The dynamic. It's just this one holiday that turned into another holiday, and then a birthday, and then just a general ongoing absence. I had been making myself smaller for 3 years, agreeing to whatever arrangement Liam decided was appropriate, telling myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that if I was patient and flexible enough, eventually there would be room for me. I talked to Eleanor about it one Sunday when Frank was outside. I wasn't planning to. She asked how my son was, and I said, fine, and then I told her the truth, which was that I didn't actually know how he was because our conversations had become these careful, abbreviated things where neither of us said anything real. Eleanor put down her coffee mug. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has earned the right to say hard things. She had a younger brother, she said, Alan. They had a falling out 20 years ago over something she was now embarrassed to describe, because in retrospect it was so small, a disagreement about their mother's care that became a referendum on decades of old grievances. They had gone 6 years without speaking. Then Alan had a stroke. He recovered, but he recovered slowly, and by the time he was himself again, Eleanor had understood something she wished she had understood before. That being right and being at peace are not the same thing. That the time you spend waiting for the other person to make the first move is time you do not get back. She looked at me. I'm not telling you to accept being treated badly, she said. I'm telling you to decide what you actually want, because those are different questions and you need to know which one you're answering. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it the following Christmas, which I spent at Frank and Eleanor's with Patrick and Sandra, who were by then engaged. I thought about it on Father's Day, when my son sent a text, just a text, and I wrote back, thank you, keeping busy, thinking of you, because I had run out of ways to close the distance between us, and I was tired of trying harder than he was. I thought about it on Owen's birthday when I sent a gift, a wooden puzzle of Canada's provinces that Frank helped me pick out and received no acknowledgement at all. The not knowing hurt in a particular way, not just the absence of my son, but the absence of Owen. He was growing up. He was learning to read and losing teeth and becoming a person, and I was receiving none of it. 2 years after that first Thanksgiving at the Empress, I was at the Kowalski house on a Sunday in October when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professional and careful in the way of someone delivering news they have had to deliver before. She said she was a social worker with Island Health. She said my son had listed me as his emergency contact. She said there had been an incident. My son had been admitted to the Victoria General that morning. He had collapsed at work. They were still running tests, but it appeared to be a cardiac event. He was stable, she said, but she thought I should come. I told Frank and Eleanor where I was going. Frank said he would drive me. I said it was fine. It was only 20 minutes. He picked up his keys. He said, Thomas, I'm driving you. Eleanor came too. Of course she did. My son was in a monitored bed when I arrived. He looked smaller than I expected, the way people always look smaller in hospital beds, the context of walls and equipment reducing them. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's eyes and my chin, and a hospital bracelet on his wrist that said his full name, James Arthur Whitfield. Liam was there. We looked at each other across the room, and he nodded slightly and I nodded back, and then we both looked at my son. Owen was in the waiting room with Liam's mother, a small boy with enormous eyes, sitting very still on a plastic chair. He looked up when I came in. He stared at me for a moment. Then he said, Grandpa? I had not been called that in over a year. I said, Hey, buddy. Yeah, it's me. He slid off the chair and came and stood next to me, not hugging, just standing close, the way children do when they want proximity without committing to it. I sat down beside him. I asked him if he had eaten. He said he had some crackers. I said crackers were pretty good. He said not really, but it was all there was. We sat there together while the hospital did what hospitals do around us. Frank and Eleanor stayed in the waiting room for 4 hours. They brought coffee from the machine down the hall. Eleanor found better chairs. Frank sat with Owen and let the boy explain, at considerable length and with great seriousness, why ambulances were better than fire trucks in almost every important way. My son had had a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. moderate severity. They would keep him for observation and run further tests, but the intervention had been timely and the prognosis was good. He would need to change some things, the cardiologist said. Stress, diet, the amount he had been pushing himself at work. I visited every day. Liam was there in the mornings and I came in the afternoons, and we maintained our careful distance. But one afternoon, coming out of the elevator, I walked into Liam in the corridor, and we stood there facing each other, and I thought, this is it. This is the conversation we have never had. But Liam looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected to see. He looked exhausted. He looked genuinely frightened. The defensive architecture I had always seen in his face had come down, not because he had become a different person, but because he was too tired to hold it up. He said, "He keeps asking for you. When you're not here, he asks when you're coming back." I said, "Then I'll be here every day until he's home." Liam looked at the floor. He said, "I know things have been." He stopped. "I know I've made things difficult." I waited. He said, "James always defended you. I didn't make it easy for him to do that." It was not a full apology. It was not a reckoning or an accounting of everything that had been taken from me. But it was something. It was a man who was frightened and humbled and saying out loud, for the first time, that he had been part of the problem. I said, "What matters right now is that he gets well." Liam nodded. He looked like he might say more, and then didn't. We rode the elevator back to the ward in silence, and then went to stand on either side of my son's bed, where Owen was drawing a picture of an ambulance on a piece of paper the nurse had given him. My son came home 10 days later. Liam's parents went back to Calgary. Liam went back to work, half days at first, then full days, and the task of being with my son during his recovery became, in practice, mine. I came in the mornings. I made breakfast. I drove Owen to his school in Saanich and picked him up in the afternoon. I sat with my son while he did the cardiac exercises the physiotherapist had sent home, talking about nothing, about the news and old hockey seasons and what we thought Owen would be like when he grew up. One afternoon, 3 weeks in, my son asked me to sit down. He had the look of someone who had been composing something in his head for a long time and was finally saying it out loud. He said, "When I was lying in that bed the first night, when I didn't know what was happening, I kept thinking about Owen growing up, not knowing you, about him being 40 years old and barely remembering you because I let that happen. I didn't say anything." He said, "I kept telling myself Liam's concerns were valid, that I was keeping the peace, that it was just a hard adjustment period and it would sort itself out eventually. But it didn't sort itself out. I just kept adjusting and adjusting until you weren't there at all." He looked at me. "I am so sorry, Dad. I had waited years to hear those words. I had imagined the moment and rehearsed my responses and thought about what I would need him to say to make it right. But sitting there in his living room on a Tuesday morning while Owen was at school and the November rain was coming down outside, all of that evaporated. He was my son. He was 41 years old, and he had nearly died, and he was looking at me the way he had looked at me as a small boy when he needed me to tell him something true. I said, "I love you. I have always loved you." "I never stopped," he said. "I know." I think that's what made it worse, knowing that and still letting it happen. We sat there for a while. Then I asked if he wanted me to make tea. He said yes. So I went and made tea, the way his grandmother used to make it, strong with a little honey, and we drank it and watched the rain come in off the straight, and it was not a full healing, not yet, but it was a beginning. I want to tell you about the Sunday he first came to Frank and Eleanor's. It was January. My son was recovered enough to drive, and I had told him about the Kowalskis, not all at once but in pieces over the preceding weeks, until he had a picture of them, the way you build a picture of people you heard about but haven't met. He said he wanted to go. He wanted to thank them. I called Eleanor. She said, "Bring everyone, Liam too if he wanted. She would make the chowder." Liam didn't come. That was all right. It was too soon, maybe, or too complicated in ways I didn't need to understand. But my son came, and he brought Owen, and we stood on the front porch of that small house in James Bay on a gray January afternoon, and Eleanor opened the door and looked at my son for a moment, and then looked at me, and I nodded, and she said, "You must be James. Come in, come in. Your father's told us everything wonderful about you." My son laughed, surprised. He looked at me. I shrugged. Eleanor took his coat. Frank came from the kitchen, wiped his hands on a dish towel, shook my son's hand like they were old friends being reintroduced. Owen found the shelf of board games in the living room within 45 seconds and began making his case for Catan, which he called the one with the hexagons. Frank said, "The boy has good taste." Dinner was loud and full. Patrick and Sandra were there, 4 months from their wedding, and Sandra's nursing stories made my son laugh so hard he had to put down his spoon. Owen ate 2 bowls of chowder and decided that Frank was his second best friend after his classmate Benjamin, which Frank accepted as a great honor. On the drive home, Owen fell asleep in the back seat before we reached the highway. My son drove quietly for a while. Then he said, "Why didn't I know about them sooner?" I didn't answer right away. I watched the lights of Victoria move past the window. I said, "You didn't know because I didn't tell you. And I didn't tell you because for a long time I needed them to be just mine, something that existed outside of all of it." He was quiet. I said, "They showed me something I had forgotten, that I was worth knowing. Not because of what I could provide or what role I filled, but just because of who I was. When you haven't felt that in a long time, you protect it." My son pulled up to my building and put the car in park, but didn't move to unlock the doors. He said, "I should have protected it too." "I should have protected you." I told him we were both learning. That was all I said, but I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder for a moment, the way I used to when he was young, before everything got complicated and carefully managed, and he covered my hand with his, and neither of us said anything else. That was 2 years ago. Liam and I are not close. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. He is polite when I come to the house, and I am polite in return, and we have reached a kind of careful respect that may, over time, become something warmer. My son is working in therapy on the patterns that allowed all of this to happen, which takes courage, and I tell him that when he needs to hear it. Owen calls me Grandpa without hesitation now and has strong opinions about which of Frank's board games are best, and has appointed himself the official taste tester of Eleanor's baking. Last Thanksgiving, I sat at Frank and Eleanor's table with my son beside me and Owen between us, arguing about white meat versus dark meat with the confidence of a 6-year-old who has never once been wrong about anything. Patrick was there, and Sandra, and Christine had come from Toronto with her husband and their 2 teenagers, who were immediately recruited by Owen into something involving the backyard and a flashlight. Frank stood up to say grace, which he always does, a short, quiet thing that mentions everyone present by name. He got to mine and said, "And Thomas, who found us on a cold November night and never quite left, for which we are endlessly grateful." Eleanor said, "Here." My son looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with the full, uncomplicated look of someone who finally understands what they almost lost. And I looked back at him, and that was enough. I spent years making myself small enough to fit into whatever space I was allowed. I spent years believing that if I asked for less, I would eventually be given more. I was wrong. What changed everything was not trying harder or being more accommodating. What changed everything was a retired shop teacher in a crooked tie who thought it was worth walking across a restaurant to invite a stranger to his table. If you are sitting somewhere alone right now, waiting for the people who should want you to finally want you, I want you to say yes to the table you're being offered. Say yes to the chowder on Sunday. Say yes to the friendship that has no obligation attached to it, no history, no debt. You are not too old and it is not too late, and the family you find may be the one that teaches the family you were born with what they nearly threw away. The best thing I ever did for my son was stop disappearing. The best thing I ever did for myself was let Frank Kowalski straighten my priorities the same way Eleanor straightened his tie, with care, without making a production of it, because that's what people do when they've decided you matter. I think about the sweet potatoes I left on my kitchen counter that November. I never made them. I put them in the compost 3 days later, and I didn't let myself feel anything about it, which was its own kind of answer about where I had gotten to by then. What I understand now, looking back across 7 years, is that every consequence in this story was earned. Not in a punishing way, not in the way of some force keeping score, but in the plain and ordinary way that actions accumulate into outcomes. I spent 3 years making myself smaller and more agreeable and less present, and the result was that I became genuinely absent. James spent years telling himself that keeping Liam comfortable was the same as keeping the peace, and the result was that he nearly ran out of time to find out the difference. Liam spent years building walls around his household and treating my presence as a problem to be managed. And the result was that when he was most frightened, standing in a hospital corridor watching the person he loved most hooked up to monitors, I was the one who showed up every afternoon without being asked. None of these outcomes were accidents. They were the slow, patient result of choices made and not made over a long stretch of ordinary days. What Frank did, walking across a restaurant in a crooked tie to invite a stranger to his table, was a moral act. I don't use that word lightly, and I don't mean anything grand by it. I mean that he looked at another person, assessed what that person needed, and acted on it at a small cost to himself. That's the whole thing. That's the entire foundation of it. And what that simple act set in motion, 2 years of Sunday chowder, Eleanor's hard, honest questions, Owen learning to say Grandpa without hesitation. None of it would have existed without that one moment of someone deciding that a stranger's loneliness was worth the awkwardness of crossing a room. I had to learn to receive that. That was harder than I expected. I had spent enough years in a family structure where my value was conditional that I had started to believe, somewhere underneath everything, that I needed to earn my place at every table. Eleanor was the one who named it. She didn't use those words, but that's what she meant when she said, you need to decide what you actually want, because there's a difference between accepting bad treatment and accepting peace. It took intelligence to hear that, real intelligence, not the kind measured in credentials, but the kind that requires you to sit with an uncomfortable idea long enough to understand it. I was 64 years old and a retired infrastructure engineer, and I had to learn from a retired nurse in James Bay that I was allowed to want things. And then I had to stay. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The staying. Showing up to Frank's on Sunday when I didn't feel like company. Driving to the hospital every afternoon for 10 days. Sitting with my son through the slow, undramatic work of recovery. Not disappearing when it was hard, not making my presence conditional on being appreciated for it. That kind of endurance isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like much from the outside, but it is, I think, the most important thing a person can offer. The willingness to still be there on the unremarkable Tuesday, in the ordinary afternoon when no one is watching and nothing is resolved, and you stay anyway because that is simply who you have decided to be. Owen knows that now. He'll know it more as he gets older, that his grandfather stayed. That's enough for me.